Hey guys, welcome back to Trek on the Tube. I know it's only been a short while since I released my last video, but the only reason why I made that one was to help you better understand this one. So that's why I'm releasing them so close together, and I've made them two parts of one explanation. Isn't that right, Bob? Now, last time we talked about TV and movie terminology, how that should be used in general, and how it relates to Star Trek. This time, we'll be talking about the big scary word that is canon. To be clear, I do think it is really important for this channel to address the issue because, first of all, I do make a point of only explaining things that are accepted as canon. Secondly, I think knowing what is and what isn't can really help new fans when deciding where and when to start watching. So canon, what is it? What does it mean? And what's it got to do with Star Trek? Well, if you want to go all the way back to the origins of the word, it's essentially a synonym for rule or law. But then it grew into something greater. Canon started being more of a word that defines a list of certified or accepted works from a certain artist, religion, or craft. You see, for example, biblical canon is all the sacred books recognized as genuine. Before long, the word also started being used in works of fiction, the first time being for the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The term was used to differentiate and separate the Sherlock Holmes stories he wrote from all the others. Canon, in a way, certified authenticity. Now fast forward a few years and canon has made its way into every major franchise or story being created, especially where intense fandoms are involved, be it with novels, comic books, movies, TV series, plays, or even just artwork, or all of them at once. Canon has become a very important factor to a lot of people. There's no real explanation as to why canon is more a thing now than say 20 years ago, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say it's got something to do with the prequel trend, but more on that later. Okay, so to define the modern meaning of the word as simply as possible, canon in modern fiction defines the material accepted as officially part of the universe the story is set in. It can be established and confirmed either by the original creator or the current person, team, or studio responsible for the property. That's what it is, and that's how it's decided. Now, usually canon isn't that big of a deal because as long as your sequel or spin-off is consistent with the original movie, no one can really complain. Of course, we're not talking about quality here, we're talking about in-universe coherence. Aliens is a great sequel to Alien, The Lost World is a somewhat underwhelming sequel to Jurassic Park, but regardless, both make sense in their respective established universes. And then of course, if you're doing a reboot or a remake, none of that matters because you're essentially restarting canon. Of course, it's not always that easy. And this is why I said prequels could be the reason why canon has become such a major thing over these past few years. You see, when you release a sequel, no matter how dumb it is, it still works because it takes place after the original. But prequels often have a tendency of feeling out of place, especially in science fiction. Better CG, better props, better costumes, just all around better technology and production value have a tendency of taking away some of the credibility. And it's not just that. Studios have a tendency to want to make every movie bigger than the last, so often prequels try to be epic and overwhelming, or at least they want to integrate some very important story elements. And then it just feels weird that none of that was ever mentioned in the original or its sequels. In any case, for a lot of people, consistency and coherence have become very important factors when watching a movie or TV series. And since today we find ourselves having sequels, prequels, and spin-offs released at the same time, it's not always easy to keep track of what's going on. The good thing is, sometimes there are official communiques released when big changes are being made. Star Wars, for example. Back in 2014, when Disney acquired the franchise, they made some major changes to canon, effectively removing 80% of it, and branding that under the Legends banner. It was a whole thing. People got mad. What? No, I know you didn't get mad, Bob, but I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about people. What do you mean, what? People in general. Just other people, not... Oh, God damn it, Bob. Now that we've defined the word, let's try focus on Star Trek and try figuring out what is and what isn't canon within the franchise. And believe me, it is no simple task. For starters, Star Trek isn't owned or run by one person. There's no one single voice that can decide what is canon and what is not, or even define where the story should go from now. Gene Roddenberry used to do that to a certain degree, but sadly he's no longer around, so it's all in the hands of the board and high-ranking executives. And then Star Trek has another huge, very unique issue. In short, it's owned by both CBS and Paramount, which both have different rights, different visions, and different business models. So not only is Star Trek not owned by one single person, it's owned by two different companies that both have very different ways of doing things and have different objectives. That's why regarding Star Trek's canon, there hasn't been an official statement in years. To be blunt, I don't think there's anyone that has the authority to do that anyway. I mean, especially not you, Bob. But that can't stop us from digging up statements from the past, because yes, there were some very interesting and official statements issued in the past. Now, these statements could be found on the official Star Trek website for a while, but now we have to refer to other websites that document what was once said, because since then StarTrek.com has taken them down. Here's the explanation of Star Trek canon as it could be found on StarTrek.com up until 2006. As a rule of thumb, the events that take place within the real action series and movies are canon or official Star Trek facts. Storylines, characters, events, stardates, etc. that take place within the fictional novels, the animated series, and the various comic lines are not canon. There are only a couple of exceptions to this rule. The Jerry Taylor pen novels Mosaic and Pathways. Many of the events in these two novels feature background details from the main Star Trek Voyager characters. Note, there are a few details from an episode of the animated adventures that have entered into Star Trek canon. The episode Yesteryear, written by DC Fontana, features some biographical background of Spock. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that up until 2006, what was considered canon in Star Trek was the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, the original series movies, The Next Generation movies, two novels, Mosaic and Pathways, and some of the facts relating to Spock's childhood from the animated series episode Yesteryear. To be honest with you, this is probably where most people still think we are when it comes to Star Trek canon. And, I mean, it would make things a lot easier, but sadly, it's not. That statement was replaced in 2006 by another statement that stayed on the website until 2010, and boy, is this new statement complicated. Or should I say, diplomatic. Okay, here we go. As a rule of thumb, the events that take place within the live-action episodes and movies are canon or official Star Trek facts. Storylines, characters, events, stardates, etc. that take place within the fictional novels, video games, animated series, and the various comic lines have traditionally not been considered part of the canon. But canon is not something set in stone. Even events in some of the movies have been called into question as to whether they should be considered canon. Ultimately, the fans, the writers, and the producers may all differ on what is considered canon, and the very idea of what is canon has become more fluid, especially as there isn't a single voice or arbiter to decide. Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry was accustomed to making statements about canon, but even he was known to change his mind. In the publishing world, there used to be two exceptions to the novel rule: the Jerry Taylor pen books Mosaic and Pathways. Many of the events in these two novels feature background details of the main Star Trek Voyager characters and were to be considered as references by writers on the show. Now that the show is over, some of these events may never be incorporated into the live-action format, so the question of whether details from these novels remain canon is open to interpretation. With regard to the animated series, there are a few details from the episode Yesteryear, written by DC Fontana, that reveal biographical background on Spock and planet Vulcan. Details from this episode have been successfully incorporated into the canon of Star Trek, such as in The Forge, and now that the animated series is out on DVD, we hope that even more can make its way in. Just to add some more information before we start explaining this new statement, following its release, StarTrek.com issued an official poll in which they asked fans whether or not the animated series should become canon. The results said yes, and since then we've had both the animated series DVDs and remastered Blu-rays that confirm its canonicity in these special features. But we're talking about 2006 to 2010, so the remastered Blu-ray version didn't exist yet, only the DVD. Okay, so to simplify, this new statement explains for starters that the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, the original series movies, and the Next Generation movies all remain canon, but maybe not necessarily. You see there's a line in there? Even events in some of the movies have been called into question. That complicates things a whole lot. As you can imagine, this is just a very diplomatic way of acknowledging the general resentment people have for Star Trek V, but it's also a very stupid way of creating debate and conflict. This, plus the fact the new statement goes on to explain the two novels previously established as canon might not be anymore, and the fact that the animated series wasn't yet validated as canon when the statement was released, just makes this whole thing a mess. But of course, it gets worse. Not only was this official statement removed from the website back in 2010, which means there's no longer any active statement, but Star Trek has also been through a lot of changes throughout the years. I mean, the Star Trek content. For example, there now exists remastered editions of the original series, the animated series, and the next generation. For the animated series and the next generation, it's not a big deal since it's pretty much just a quality upgrade, excluding a few panels. But for the original series, new visual effects were added. Changes were made to planets, ships, alien races, and who's to say what version is the most valid? Then there's the movies, which have a similar problem. Some of them have director's cuts, some of them have theatrical cuts, etc. As a fan of movies in general, I can understand the appeal of watching and discovering different versions of something you love, especially if you've already seen it many times, but when it comes to continuity, it kinda makes a mess. And then, again, going back to the technically no longer active statement, they talk about canon fluidity. What the hell does that even mean? They talk about how nothing is set in stone when it comes to the novels or the comic books. So nowadays, when Paramount or CBS bank on Discovery and Calvin Timeline tying novels and comic books to get that extra cash, some people are convinced they are part of canon. And that's why currently in the Star Trek fandom, people still have debates about the animated series, or certain novels, certain comic books, even Discovery itself. I mean, I feel like it's your fault somehow, Bob. I don't know. Before we actually end this, of course, we have to talk about the final, current, active source that could be considered a statement. StarTrek.com itself. Essentially, the website contains a database about canon information on pretty much every character, every race, every event that ever happened in Star Trek. And though I will admit it's not complete, I'm pretty sure you'd agree when I say that if an element from a certain work is included, then that work is canon. If no information whatsoever can be found on that certain work, then that work is not canon. Based on that, as it stands, we can say that all of the TV series and all of the movies are the full extent of what is officially considered canon. Any other officially licensed work isn't, even if it's released and authorized by one of the two studios. And there you go. That's it. At least until we have someone that has the authority to actually step up and define what is and what isn't canon within the Star Trek universe. On a more personal note, before I leave you, I wanted to drop a few lines about why canon is so important, why it's necessary. In an era where the cinematic universe, or the long-lasting franchise, is taking storytelling and world-building to a whole new level, a certain degree of coherence and consistency is required to perpetuate the believability of your story. No matter how great a sequel, a prequel, a spin-off is, if it contradicts the original, there's no point in making it part of the same story. The technology shown on screen in the original series, for example, is ridiculously outdated compared to the current real-world technology, or at least in part. It's pretty safe to assume the panels on our ships won't look like that 200 years from now. But in the context of its own universe, that technology is fact. That aesthetic is fact. And so new content has a duty to either respect and recreate that fact, or find a damn good way of explaining why it doesn't. And an aesthetic is not just an aesthetic. A look is not just a look, especially in a science fiction franchise where technology and alien appearance are key plot points in many of the stories told over time. Canon is a word that people seem to be annoyed by nowadays, and probably because it's been thrown around a lot, but truth be told, the only reason why the word itself keeps on coming up is usually because it's not respected. Sadly, nowadays it's a word often used out of spite or to hide behind when dissatisfied, but canon shouldn't be the enemy of the fan or the creator. It shouldn't be intimidating. It's a tool, a thread that should be embraced and used when crafting each new iteration of a story. Okay, I hope this second part helped you just as much as the first. I hope now you can kind of make sense of all of these crazy words. I hope canon makes more sense to you. Yeah. Thank you very much for watching. As usual, remember to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and most of all, live long and prosper.